I just want to say welcome. I'm really happy to have everybody here today. My name is Steve Morse. I'm the Executive Director of the Minnesota Environmental Partnership, based in Minnesota, of course, one of the co-chairs of the Healing Our Waters Coalition, which is also known as HOW. We are really happy to host this discussion today with our partners, Friends of the Mississippi River and the Healing Our Waters Coalition. Thank you for taking the time to discuss emerging strategies to address one of the most intractable water quality issues we face in the upper Midwest. That is how to protect water and restore water quality in areas dominated by row crop agriculture of corn and soybeans. Growing up in the bluff country along the Mississippi River in southeast Minnesota, I was appalled some 35 years ago when I first started to learn about the presence of farm chemicals in what we thought was clean groundwater aquifers. This was an unacceptable affront to the abundant natural resources I had grown up holding in such high regard. It was then, as a considerably younger and more naive person, I successfully challenged our local state senator, running on a platform of protecting our groundwater from ag pollution. After 35 years, after passing landmark groundwater protection legislation, historic policies for statewide watershed cleanup, constitutionally dedicated clean water funding, and seeing the adoption of rules said to protect groundwater from nitrate contamination, I can report that I have yet to fulfill that campaign promise from long ago. We're not making significant progress where it comes to matter the most, and that's in the water. Counting on just our Minnesota state funds, we've spent well over an additional $1 billion in the last 15 years to clean up our water. Farmers have changed practices and continue to do so, but actually reaching our water quality goals remains a dream, almost an imaginary mirage in the distant horizon. And experience tells me that if we keep on relying on adoption of conventional ag best management practices as the solution and expect to reach our water quality goals, we may in fact be dreaming. And that's why we're here today, to consider another way, a different approach beyond the suite of options of modifying practices and how we grow crops, but also not setting the land aside and taking it out of production. We'll be talking about a third path with Kernza, winter oilseeds, and other emerging crops that provide many of the ecological benefits of set-aside lands, but produce a harvestable crop that can be marketed for income. We refer to these crops as continuous living cover, with living roots in the ground year-round. These crops can be incorporated into existing cropping systems to diversify both the landscape and farm economies. You'll find the link to the agenda in the chat, and I believe that, or at least it will be appearing soon. So it's on your invitation, and it's also in the chat. We'll be starting off in Module 1 by looking at the fundamental science that drives our water quality problems and taking a look at what modeling from 2 states tells us about what it will take to reach our water quality goals. And we'll consider how we got to where we are with today's ag production systems and the tried and true road to creating viable new options. In Module 2, we'll look at the theory driving this work forward and explore 2 case studies of some of the most promising continuous living cover crops and look at their opportunities and challenges. In addition to a 5-minute break to allow people to stretch a bit, we will also take some time for Q&A during this module. Module 3 outlines some of the federal policy barriers and opportunities for advancing continuous living cover solutions in the upper Midwest, and Module 4 will explore opportunities for federal support and pathways to inform federal action, including development of the 2023 Farm Bill. With the webinar Zoom format that we're using, we encourage you to share your thoughts in the chat, and they will be visible by all participants, and submit questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will be recording this webinar, so please let us know if you'd like access to the recording after we are finished. Before I move to the opening speaker, if we could have just the next slide, and let me say just a bit about the program under which we're doing this. This is called the Kernza CAP, and it's a USDA Institute of Food and Agriculture program funded through the Sustainable Agricultural Systems Coordinated Agricultural Programs. And what the map shows is participating institutions from around the country, the upper Midwest, as well as California. With this incredible lineup of speakers, we'll be sharing lots of information. So hang on as we kick it off with some comments by the ever thoughtful and enterprising Ann Schwagel of Prairie Point Farm in Browns Valley, Minnesota, She will be providing a farmer's perspective on continuous living cover crops. Take it away, Ann.
Sounds good. Thank you for having me. Just a quick check that everyone can hear. Microphone's working good. Great, thanks.
Great.
Perfect. So I just, as a farmer who's been around the block a couple times in an advocacy role, I just, before we kick off, I'd love for everyone here to re-examine any kind of assumptions they might have. And know that farmers are necessary partners in achieving your environmental, well, all of our environmental ecosystem and biodiversity goals. If we farmers win with the crops that we're going to talk about today, environmental groups will win with their goals. That this is not a zero-sum equation between farmers and environmental groups. So a quick note of introduction about me. I am a grain farmer in Western Minnesota. I farm with my husband and his family. We produce certified organic corn, soybeans, oats, kernza, and winter camelina. We also have a small pastured hog operation as well that keeps us plenty busy. We have grown both conventional and organic crops. Right now we are certified organic. So some challenges that face growers who are both conventional and organic are narrowing windows to get crops planted and harvested due to more frequent and intense weather patterns. Farmers are increasingly being asked to be a part of the solution to climate change. We're going to have to modify our cropping systems to mitigate risk, and we can't just grow 2 warm season crops. Whether we like it or not, policymakers will be asking farmers and perhaps telling us in the future to contribute to being part of the carbon solution. Traditional growers, what cover cropping is all well and good for us, and we can see the benefits to it from increased water infiltration, decreased compaction. But the only way I know that the stat out there is that, we're at 5% adoption for cover cropping. And I feel like the only way that you're going to get widespread adoption by farmers is to give them a tool, or a crop in this case, that we can turn around and sell. Making it a market-based solution rather than a subsidy-based solution is what's going to increase the scalability of this kind of continuous living cover cropping model, which is why the Forever Green CLC crops are so critical to us here in the Upper Midwest. To make that market-based solution, we're going to need agronomic support, of course, from Forever Green, but it will also take a lot of hard work and sustained investment in the marketplace, which is why over the last couple of years, year and a half now, I've been working with other growers in Minnesota and Southwest Wisconsin to organize ourselves into a marketing cooperative called the Perennial Promise Growers Cooperative. We work together to protect the price and retain value to producers so that it can be a scalable model for alternative crops to get out onto the landscape, because these crops need to compete with my other cropping acres. So I'm excited today to talk kind of more in depth about kernza and winter camelina and how that fits within my cropping system and why it serves our farm. And I'm looking forward to kind of the discussion we're going to have. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Ann. Thanks for those grounding comments. They're super helpful. And remember, you can put in questions anytime, just to type them into the Q&A, or you can put them in the chat. And we will be responding to at least some of those live at the end of Module 2. But we'll save our question and response time until then, just to keep the show rolling. With that, let me turn to Dr. Don Wise, who has been involved in development of these crops for many decades, mind you. He is an agronomy professor at the University of Minnesota and is co-director of the Forever Green Initiative at the University of Minnesota. Don, let me turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Steve, for being introduced as an old guy, but that is true. Thanks for the invitation to talk a little bit about the current status of agriculture in the Midwest, which is the basis for the framing of the Forever Green initiative. And as Steve says, it's been really in play for probably about 30 years. And the reason people are learning more about it now is because some of the crops that have been under development are now moving out into the arena to be commercialized. So very exciting, exciting time. So when you look across the Midwest, this is kind of the picture you see every year in the spring until about mid-June. 2 crops with limited soil cover, and we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. Next slide, please. So this transition from a very diverse, highly functional landscape in the 40s to what we have today occurred really pretty fast. Basically moving from agriculture systems that had livestock as part of the farming system that supported a range of annuals and perennials to what we have today has really been the major switch that has occurred. Moving to specialized farms that specialize on basically producing corn and soybeans. Please. So this is really what we ended up with. A large portion of the certain counties, 90% of the landscape, 90% of the landscape is in these 2 crops. Next, please. So basically, what I'm going to show you is what we see on the landscape from a satellite. Next. So in April, you can see the brown spot across that region where corn and soybeans are being produced. Next slide. And that brown spot exists into about mid-June, and then the landscape starts to cover in July. In August, great green color, but then again, in the middle of September, it's brown again. So I always ask groups, well, you count the months that it's covered. July, August, September, 3 out of 12 do we have a landscape cover. Next slide. So basically we have the beginning of the season in the seasons that is open and for erosion, the movement of nitrate and nitrogen, soluble phosphorus through the system. And it just happens that the period that's brown is a period of high rainfall, especially in the spring, moving nitrate nitrogen down into our tire lines and off into surface water. Please. Next slide. And tile lines, are a major component of the agriculture production system in the Midwest. And as that soil is not covered, water is not being used, our tile lines flow extensively during that brown period of time. 71% of the tile line movement during that period. Well, that's an interesting slide. So basically what it says is that 75% of the nitrate nitrogen that's moving off the landscape basically comes from these agricultural systems. Next slide, please. So basically, what are the consequences? If you just look at water quality, soil erosion, the movement of phosphorus off the landscape, impact of nitrogen in the Gulf of Mexico, and then local at home, the contamination of water wells, whether public or private, across large portions of Minnesota and across the Midwest, contamination of the drinking water supply, all contributions of this system. What captured my attention many years ago was this work done by Giles Randall at Waseca, where we were looking at best management practices with continuous corn and soybean rotation, the appropriate nitrogen levels. And over the years, basically the loss ranged, from 20 pounds per acre, and in many years up to 80 pounds of nitrate nitrogen moving through the tile line system. But in that same experiment, where you had crops like alfalfa and a mixture of grasses, the loss was 2 pounds of nitrate nitrogen through that system. So that's when the idea that started to develop in my mind about what if we could develop economically viable agriculture systems that were this efficient in terms of nitrogen use and water use. So when I talk about the new forever green crops, we're talking about crops that take the nitrogen loss, phosphorus loss to extremely low levels and are highly productive and highly profitable. That's the background for the Forever Green initiative. So the idea is to develop those crops and cropping systems. We talk about crops, forever green crops, but we're really talking about forever green cropping systems that basically keep that soil covered, hold water in place, hold nitrogen in place, advance soil health, but are highly profitable to the farmer. Many of our state programs, as we look for long-term nitrogen reduction, nitrate loss from these systems, basically, if you know the next slide, please, I think click it twice, basically suggests for us to meet our water quality goals here, at least in Minnesota, you can do some advances with tile line management, nitrogen use efficiency in terms of rates. But if you really want to go and get close to meeting the long-term nitrogen reduction goals, we have to have a new set of plant materials on the landscape. And the Forever Green Initiative is attempting to develop this new set of plant materials that don't just cover the landscape, but are also profitable to the farmers, Annie has said. So the Forever Green Initiative, developing new food and energy products, new economic opportunities that also provide those ecosystem services. And that's really what this program is all about. Produce new options for farmers that provide new economic opportunities, as well as producing those ecosystem services for society. So we're focusing on crops that can produce new oils, fiber, protein, and phytonutrients, for example, that have value in the marketplace. So we're focusing on the development of winter annuals, fall planted that survive the winter in the upper Midwest, produce that covering of the brown in the fall, but produce an economically viable product, as well as the cap that you're visiting with today in terms of the Kernza cap is a good example of one of the perennial crops that's under development in this program in partnership with many other entities across the United States, including the Land Institute. So these new crops and cropping system, high value food and feed and energy ingredients in the marketplace, reduction in potentially in greenhouse gases, healthy food ingredients and products, and also stability for our rural communities, for economic development, and this forever equitable component that will be discussed later on in terms of equity within the food and agriculture system as we roll out these new crops. So ecosystem services, just to remind us what we're talking about: soil health, clean water, nutrient management, pollinator habitat, potential for carbon sequestration, and soil protection, please. So how do we get there? It's not easy. It's not easy. But this is really what we are so excited about, that we've been able to develop over the last 30 years in the Forever Green Initiative, is this continuous development system, from plant breeding and genomics, agronomics, food science, commercialization, and supply chain development. So as we roll out each of these crops, it's like rolling out a new company, all the way from basic genomics to the development of the supply chain and the markets. So let me just give you an example of from pictures that were taken in the last this year. This is Kernza at the top this fall, and the picture on the left is a picture taken the same day on the St. Paul campus, just giving you the idea about this continuous living cover, and the differences that you get following an inch rainfall in terms of soil erosion. And you can imagine the leaching of nitrate nitrogen in that system. And And below, winter camellia this April, planted in the fall of 2020. This is the type of growth that was observed this spring as compared to a field on the left that was just being prepared on the same day in April, giving you an idea again of that green cover covering that brown in comparison to the current agriculture system. Next slide. So here we go. So you're going to talk about two of these crops today, Camellia and Kernza. But I want you to understand that we have a whole array of new crops under development. Each of these crops that are listed here have an active genomics, breeding, agronomic, food science system behind it, right? So these are a series of crops that we want to roll out. And I have the philosophy, we have the philosophy that we're not just going to focus on one or two crops. That has led us to where we're at today. So we want to focus on the development of an array of new crops that provide functional on the landscape to produce those ecosystem services and provide new economic opportunities for farmers. And one step beyond that, also for rural communities. Stabilizing our rural communities, increasing profitability to farmers, and those ecosystems outcomes for society as a whole. So thank you very much. And obviously over time, even outside of today, I'd be very happy to talk to any of you online or any way you would like if you want some additional follow-up conversations. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Professor Wise, for that excellent background. Now we're going to turn to two case studies. The first from Minnesota, where Evelyn Riley, also from the Forever Green or Greenlands Blue Water Project at the University of Minnesota, will talk about modeling on achieving water quality goals in Minnesota and how we can get there. So, Evelyn?
Hi, so nice to be here. So Steve said, my name is Evelyn. I recently finished a master's degree in agronomy at the U of M, and my thesis work was on how Kernza can help reduce nitrate contamination of drinking water. And I'll be giving a very brief overview of Minnesota's water challenges, which are illustrated well by this picture, the sediment-filled Minnesota River on the left, draining primarily agricultural land, meeting and polluting the Mississippi River on the right. Next, please. So I think it's important to start out by saying that Minnesotans really care about clean water. It's an important part of our culture, our economy, outdoor recreation, and the beauty of the state. And we are rightfully concerned about pollution. Next, please. So as you can see indicated by the red areas on the map, nearly half of Minnesota's surface waters are impaired, meaning that they don't meet standards for aquatic life, fishing, swimming, or drinking. Next. Now, this does vary throughout the state because Minnesota has 3 distinct ecoregions that differ by soil type, vegetation, and geography. Water quality tends to be fairly good in the heavily forested northwest region, but worsens in the central and southwest regions, where only 16% of streams meet water quality standards for aquatic life. Next, please. In the southwest corner of the state, recent surveys found that there were actually no swimmable or fishable lakes at all. Unfortunately, pollution is not limited to surface waters. Nearly 10% of private wells in vulnerable areas exceed safe drinking water standards for nitrate. And in some areas, as many as 30 to 40% do. This is particularly concerning because many homeowners do not regularly test wells and may not be aware of contamination. Even if they do, costs of water treatment or digging a new well may be more than many families can afford. This is a problem for public wells. Public water supply wells across the state have elevated nitrate levels, and more than 50 communities have significantly elevated levels, including some close to or even exceeding the health risk limit of 10 parts per million. Like private wells, treating the water or finding new drinking water sources can be prohibitively expensive. So we talked briefly about the scope of impaired water quality. I'll take a moment now to discuss the two major pollutants of concern, phosphorus and nitrate nitrogen. The primary source of phosphorus pollution by far is agricultural runoff, followed by wastewater and stream bank erosion. There has been a 35% decrease in phosphorus concentrations at the Hastings Dam, but this is mostly from improvements in wastewater treatment, so we still need improvement in the agricultural sphere. Nitrate, next slide please, also comes primarily from cropland via tidal drainage and groundwater contamination. Unlike phosphorus, nitrate concentrations have increased by about 18% in recent decades. And again, here we need improvement primarily in agriculture to reduce those concentrations. So a brief reality check as we talk about agricultural improvements. Next slide, please. To approach nutrient reduction goals, we would need 100% adoption of all the conventional best management practices, which would entail some yield reductions and added costs. So things like tile drain improvements that Don talked about, much higher cover crop adoption. And these things are basically impossible to achieve at that level. We really need a paradigm shift. So next slide, please. How can we do that? These figures show areas of improvement needed to reach Minnesota's nutrient reduction goals. So what I want you to notice here for both phosphorus and nitrate is the green bars representing continuous living cover, things like perennials, winter annuals, and managed rotational grazing that keep living roots in the soil year round. These nutrient reduction goals cannot be met through traditional best management practices for cropland alone. And this really echoes what Don was saying. We need to transition annual systems to continuous living cover systems, which can include annuals. But we require this on a huge scale, millions of acres. And this is where exciting new crops like kerns fit in. And as Anne said, they need to be attractive options for farmers, and we need to support them with policy changes. So with that, I'll turn it over to our next speaker, and thanks very much.
Great, wonderful job. Thank you. Thank you. We appreciate that very much, Evelyn. Then I'd like to ask Associate Professor Margaret Kalsick from Ohio State University to present some of the situation analysis, landscape analysis from Ohio. So, Margaret.
Thank you, Steve. All right, well, this is going to mirror that last presentation Evelyn just gave. We're looking now at the Maumee River Basin, which drains to western Lake Erie. And again, I think you could see similar case studies across the Midwest, at least. But let's zoom in here on Lake Erie. So next slide. Lake Erie has a long history of nutrient impairment. So more recently, we definitely have impairment in the form of both summer harmful algal blooms and hypoxia in two different parts of the lake. And nutrients generally drive these algae blooms. Phosphorus has been determined to be the main driver, but nitrogen may play a role as well, especially perhaps in the toxicity of the blooms. And the Maumee River, which is shown there, the Maumee River watershed, is just so large and so agricultural that it is a dominant source of those nutrients. Next slide. So I mentioned the long history of impairment. Back in the 60s, 70s, there was impairment that was mainly driven by point sources, but then once we tightened those point sources and reduced those phosphorus losses from point sources, we were actually able to meet the target that was set for the whole lake at 11,000 metric tons of phosphorus. So this schematic on the left shows sources by color. I know you can't really see them because you have to zoom in pretty far, but basically the message here is we were meeting our target once we dealt with those point sources. But more recently, in the last couple of decades, we started to have the same problems return, those harmful algal blooms, that hypoxia, even though we were still meeting our target. And so some science took place in the last 10 years where we really tried to figure out, well, what is driving this reeutrophication of Lake Erie? How can we change our targets to actually meet the end goal for water quality in Lake Erie? And so while the old target was a whole lake target for 100,000 metric tons of phosphorus, we ended up with targets specific to the Western Lake Erie Basin, as well as Central, and so whole lake, and then Western as well, specific targets. And the targets are reductions, 40% reductions from a 2008 baseline of not only total phosphorus, or TP, but dissolved reactive phosphorus, or DRP on my slides. And these are sort of equivalent to some concentration targets, 0.05 milligrams per liter for DRP, for instance. And these targets were to be met 9 years out of 10. So these are much more nuanced targets. This is what we have to work with right now since 2016 in Lake Erie. And so this is what our modeling and our measurement and all of this work is going towards. How do we meet these targets? So because the watersheds are so agricultural, we know that agricultural conservation has to be part, or perhaps the majority, of getting us to meeting these targets. So the approach that my research group, in a very collaborative with many other research groups and many policymakers and other stakeholders, we took an approach to use models to figure out how can we meet those targets. So the question was, what types and rates of conservation practice adoption could reach the new water quality targets? And so we used multiple models for the Maumee River watershed and a stakeholder-driven process to define scenarios of what might be feasible to achieve in this watershed. Next slide. We used, most of the models used the Soil and Water Assessment Tool, or SWOT model. I'm only going to go so far in this conversation to mention that it is a combination of inputs of soils, land use, slopes, and weather inputs, daily outputs of water movement and nutrient movement through the landscape and to the watershed outlet, or Lake Erie. Next slide. So the modeling collaboration was 5 groups using the SWOT model and USGS using the Sparrow model, with that goal of simulating those paths to meeting the targets. Next slide. It was a stakeholder engaged process, as I mentioned. There were folks around the table from all different angles of looking at this environmental and agricultural problem. Next slide. Here are some results. You don't have to understand everything you're seeing on this slide, but I want to show you the data behind the conclusions that we are coming to. So what we did is we plotted for all those models, like different scenarios that we ran of maybe, heavy lift, but maybe possible levels of conservation. And so what we're showing here is the years that the target would be met under the scenarios. And so if you look at the top there, the green bar, that's what we're aiming for, 9 out of 10 to 10 out of 10 years. Total phosphorus is blue, dissolved reactive phosphorus is orange, and these different scenarios, we have our baseline, which is what's currently happening in the landscape. So 3 out of 10 years, we're meeting the target with what we have already. And then the scenarios to the right of that are different levels of adoption of different practices, but in general, it's at least 50% of cropland having at least 3 practices, not necessarily new practices, because some might already be out there. But this is heavy lift. This is a lot of adoption. And it was considered possibly feasible by our stakeholder process, but still a heavy lift. And what we found was that for total phosphorus, the blue, if you look at that, the black line there in the middle, that's the median or average of the models. We were able to approach that 9 out of 10 year target under many of those scenarios for total phosphorus. But for dissolved reactive phosphorus, the orange, we barely moved the needle towards that target. And these practices were selected specifically because we thought they might deal with dissolved reactive phosphorus, which is very hard to intercept. So this was a little bit discouraging that we only moved to 4 years out of 10 meeting the target under these pretty massive adoption rates of practices in our models. If you go to the next slide, the same scenarios are shown here. And I just wanted to mention that we are looking at nitrogen, and we do think nitrogen could play a role here. And so I've shown you here just with numbers what the nitrogen reductions are, total nitrogen reductions for those different scenarios. Keep in mind that we did not pick the practices for nitrogen reduction. So this is just kind of a co-benefit of these scenarios, that we get some nitrogen reduction as well. But an interesting thing is that, and I'm still figuring out what the implications are for this, but if we reduce phosphorus a lot going into the lake, but nitrogen only a little bit, we increase our nitrogen to phosphorus ratio of the lake, and that could have ecosystem level ramifications as well. And I didn't go into the details of what practices we looked at, but again, they were ones that we thought were promising for phosphorus and that we thought were feasible. They included things like cover crops, subsurface application of phosphorus fertilizer, buffers, wetlands, etc. Our findings basically are that, yes, there are multiple pathways that we could approach those total phosphorus targets, and that gives us some flexibility. Maybe we don't have to mandate a particular suite of practices. Maybe people can choose from many. And so on the right, you can see that we have new incentives in Ohio under this H2 Ohio program, where there are 10 different practices that Ohio is looking to promote and incentivize in this region to try to reach these targets. However, widespread adoption of these would be needed to meet the total phosphorus target. And unfortunately, we simulate that we're not going to even approach that dissolved reactive phosphorus target. And that form of phosphorus is bioavailable, ready for uptake. It's very important for fueling those harmful algae blooms. So I'm not showing you here anything about perennial crops because that wasn't a scenario that we ran in this exercise, but I think this shows that there is a need to develop and test innovative practices that might reach dissolved reactive phosphorus in this watershed and others. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that look from the Maumee River in Ohio. Appreciate that presentation. Let us now turn to a perspective from St. Louis, and this is Dr. Allison Miller, who is a professor at St. Louis University at the Danforth Center, and she's going to just provide us a little historical context for developing new crops and new systems. So, Allison?
Great, thanks so much, Steve, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. So as Steve mentioned, I work in St. Louis. I'm a principal investigator at the Danforth Plant Science Center. This is a private, independent, nonprofit research institution whose mission is to improve the human condition through plant science. Okay, so if we take a look at the crops that we have today, we've done an excellent job of developing highly productive, highly refined, various species that came from really around the world. Next slide, please. But looking back and taking a historical perspective, agriculture originated more than 10,000 years ago. And over time, since then, it has evolved first into early agricultural processes, early tools, then more productive monocultures developed most recently, or more recently in the middle of the 1900s, the Green Revolution, which produced really high yielding varieties of many different crops. Next slide, please. And today, what we see looking across the Midwest here, for example, at a field of corn, is incredible agricultural intensification. So looking at the graph at the bottom, the productivity of maize has increased almost every year for the past 100 years. This is really an incredible feat of both agronomy and plant breeding. But there is a remaining question that's been addressed here already this morning, which is this issue of soil erosion and general ecosystem services. And it's been estimated that about half of the world's topsoil has been lost in the last 150 years. Next slide, please. So what we're thinking about today is that these agricultural systems that have been evolving since their inception are really continuing to evolve. And this is the focus of my research and what I think is an incredibly exciting and hopeful undertaking that many of us on this call and elsewhere around the country and the world are addressing. So can we develop crops that have both agricultural and economically viable products, but also ecological services? And I think many on this call will agree that we can. Next slide. So one of the things that I've been working on over the last several years with collaborators at the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, and elsewhere are perennial crops. So perennial alternatives to major annual grains and legumes. This is one of the most well-known that we'll hear a lot about today: intermediate wheatgrass, Thinopyrum intermedium, trade name Kernza. This slide, one of my favorites, juxtaposes annual wheat against the intermediate wheatgrass. And of course, immediately apparent are these huge root systems that are able to stabilize soil, build large microbial ecosystems, and provide some of those ecosystem services. So what we've been working on most recently is thinking about how we might be able to speed up this process of domestication in perennial crop candidate species. Early farmers the beginnings of agriculture really didn't incorporate these long-lived herbaceous species into their agricultural systems. So we are doing that today. So the contributions of my research group and our collaborators are trying to apply modern tools of plant phenotyping to speed up this process. So one of the ideas that we're pursuing is this concept that early stage selection might expedite breeding. If we can look at plants in their earliest stages of development and then actually make decisions on which plants to put into the next generation based on those early stages, we might be able to speed things up. So I'm going to talk today about our work in Kernza and intermediate wheatgrass on this project, but I'll just say that we are exploring this in many different species that were shown on the last slide. So how this works in the lab is that we put together a team of students and scientists and take seeds of intermediate wheatgrass that we phenotype or characterize from the seed stage. So we're looking at seed size, shape, weight. We plant all of those and we are individually barcoding all of the individuals. We put them onto an automated phenotyper at the Danforth Center. This is unfortunately, there's a video here that you might not be able to see, but this is a robot that images each plant individually each day from the side and from the top, both in regular color imaging, but also in near infrared. And then we try to take these early life stage observations of the seed size and the germination rate and the growth rate, the above ground, below ground biomass, even spectral signatures. And we ask how those traits predict features that we later see in the field, like flowering time, height, and yield. So the key part of this process is that we are tracking individuals from the greenhouses and the automated phenotyper, then out into the field itself. So the most recent experiment that we're working on with the Land Institute involves that very, if you could just go back one slide, that very high throughput automated phenotyping under controlled conditions. And then we take those plants that we phenotyped and put half of them here in St. Louis and half of them out in Salina, Kansas. This is a Kernza field that was planted just at the end of September. Next slide. And what our data are showing is that we are seeing correlations between these early life stage traits and the traits that we're seeing in the field. In other words, we can look at seed weight or seed size or seed shape and have some idea of the predictive capacity of those traits. Now, this figure is a correlation matrix. Every square that's a color is a significant correlation between two traits. And if the square is blue, it's a positive correlation. And if the square is red, it's a negative correlation. But for us, any correlation is good because that just indicates that there is some predictive capacity of these early life stage traits. So as I mentioned, we're doing this work in intermediate wheatgrass, also in sainfoin, in silphium, and in several other what we call perennial crop candidate species. And we're hopeful that this will help speed up this process of bringing new perennial crops into the agricultural environment. So I'll just briefly acknowledge our funding sources and all of the great people involved in this project. And thanks so much for listening.
Fantastic. Thanks for that explanation, Allison. I think it's so important that people understand how we get to this point. It's using new technologies on old techniques, really. So it's using some of the traditional techniques, but just accelerating them, which is producing some great results. Instead of decades, maybe we can do it in years, or instead of decades, multiple decades, maybe 1 decade. With that, let me turn it over. We're starting to module 2. And in the middle of this module, we'll have a break. I know it's a ton of information you're receiving, and keep the questions coming. I'd like to turn it over for the first presentation on Module 2, which is the promise of continuous living cover crops. now that we've got the background. And I'd like to turn it over to Professor Nick Jordan, who's also in the agronomy department at the University of Minnesota and is the co-director of the Forever Green initiative there. So I'll turn it over for Nick, and he's going to talk about the theory of change of market-based CLC crops. Take it away, Nick.
All right, great. Thanks a lot, Steve. You guys able to hear me?
Yep.
Good, good. So Peter, next slide, please. Good morning, everybody. And I'd like to talk with you about how we can move forward to advance these continuous living cover crops. We've heard a lot about their potential. So the premise of what I'm going to share with you is that, in fact, expanding continuous vegetative cover can both enhance the productivity of our farms and greatly enhance resource stewardship, especially under the duress of climate change. Peter. So just briefly to remind, continuous living cover for many different ways provides a water solution, next slide, a food security solution, next slide, a climate change solution, and can even address in very interesting ways our energy challenges. However, the question, which I hope you will get by my subtly using giant font for the word "the," is how, in fact, do we make this whole, realize these potentials and make continuous living cover economically feasible? So let me make a few observations. So we have our major food and agricultural companies making very definite and public commitments around regenerative agriculture, climate solutions from agriculture, and sustainability in general. Next slide, please, Peter. And so the implication of this is that there is clearly, not merely from these firms, but just very broadly, rapidly increasing demand for regenerative and climate smart agriculture and things that come from that. And so here we have Don Wise, who you heard from before, both asking and answering the question of how do we go forward to develop an economic basis for this continuous living cover agriculture. So this is what I want to really talk to you about. Let me just remind you of the idea that we need to come up with a set of new crops for this agriculture that provide new products, economic opportunities tied to that, and environmental benefits or ecosystem services tied to that. Next, Peter, please. And that there's a wide range of things that come from these crops. Next slide, please. And a bunch of different economic opportunities are tied to that. And as Don mentioned, a wide suite of environmental benefits are also associated with these crops. Peter, if you could back up, please, and just turn down the metronome a bit on the pace of advancing the slides. Thanks. So here we have the suite of crops in Forever Green, which Don has shared with you. And again, the main point here is that there are a lot of them. And this provides us to come up with very flexible strategies for achieving continuous living cover agriculture. So, okay, next slide, please. We've got the crops. We've got celebrity spokesmodels. Everything should be smooth sailing from here, right? Next slide, please. Au contraire, we know from the history of innovations that new innovations almost always fail to achieve impact in the world. And this is because there are a wide range of things that stand in the way of scaling up new crops. This is the well-known valley of death that innovations have to cross. Next slide, please, Peter. So Forever Green has a distinct concept of how to cross this valley of death. Next slide, please. And I want to sketch that out for you. So to get these crops out in the world, to get them across the valley of death, we need a few sort of obvious things. We need the new crops that actually deliver the goods. We need farms and supply chains that in fact produce the crops and get them to markets. And we need profitable end-use markets. Next slide, Peter. It's also really critical that we have a bunch of other pillars of support, specifically finance, supportive policy has been noted in the chat, trust and cooperation across different sectors and scales of society, and very crucially, define strategies for scaling. Next slide, please, Peter. So what's our strategy? I want to share the essence of it. And this is the idea of developing what we call pilot supply and value chain projects, which can be thought of as clusters of farms growing a particular CLC crop. And it turns out that you have to have a little bit of production, a little scale of production, to incentivize market and supply chain players to take seriously the question of what they need to develop to be able to support and make use and profit from this crop. You need these clusters to incentivize investors. And you need some way that all of the parties that have to pitch in to advance these crops can do this in a coordinated, risk-managed way, rather than in an uncoordinated way, which is very risky. And also, when you do this, you get a sense of the critically needed R&D. Next slide, Peter, please. So the Forever Green Partnership now has a bunch of these pilot supply chain projects underway. Last slide, Peter, please. And a very important thing is that all of these supply chain projects are going to more or less fail. Let's face it, that's how it works. But they're all going to learn something, and the exchange of that learning is really critical to advancing and scaling these crops. And I'll leave it at that.
Fantastic, Nick. Thanks. That was a lot of information about a complex theory of change. So great. The fun thing is now that we get to move into case studies on the two crops we're going to take a look at and go more in depth on their status. So let me just introduce the three individuals who will be talking about the first case study, which is the perennial wheatgrass Kernza, which has come up a number of times. So we're going to have Colin Curriton, who is with the commercialization team at the University of Minnesota Forever Green Project, Dr. Nicole Tauchez, who is with the Michael Fields Agricultural Institute in Wisconsin, and who you've met before, Ann Schwagel from Prairie Point Farm, who will be offering her producer's perspective. So I'll just turn it over to you. I think, Nicole, I think you are the leadoff batter here.
Yep, I'm happy to kick us off. Thanks, Steve. Next slide, please, Peter. All right, I want to give you another quick introduction to intermediate wheatgrass that goes a little bit more in depth about how we came to have a perennial grain. Intermediate wheatgrass is a perennial grass that was pretty widespread, has been selected and cultivated by humans for thousands of years, history tells us, predominantly as forage. You can see in this picture on the left. And it came from the Fertile Crescent area where many of our crops came from. And so that crop has been used as a forage. And then most of our grains in America and in Western Europe, we've used wheat, which is this picture on the bottom. And so we want to get to the productivity of wheat while maintaining the perenniality of intermediate wheatgrass. And so they selected intermediate wheatgrass as a promising grass candidate. They screened many, many different perennial grasses. Intermediate wheatgrass just happened to have a lot of desirable traits that we want in a grain that we're cultivating for food. So intermediate wheatgrass was selected by scientists as this perennial grass that we want to pursue domestication of, or selection for grain production attributes. So you can see we go, they weren't combined. This is just intermediate wheatgrass is being selected for increased seed size and other harvestability traits. So that gets us to Kernza, which is the trademarked name for intermediate wheatgrass that has been improved for grain production. This middle here is what you see is the active grain production field. That gets grown, it's swathed, it's cut down and laid in these windrows, it's called, and then those are picked up by a combine, and that gets us this grain, which you see on the bottom. And this grain can be dehulled and milled into many different foods, the most prominent of which is bread. Next slide, please, Peter. So the beauty or the magic of intermediate wheatgrass or Kernza is that whereas our annual system fields are bare in the fall, not covered. You've seen pictures of this earlier in this webinar. Kernza starts to regrow. Look at this beautiful green field. Can you click, Peter, please? So that's the magic. And then in the fall, you can use this forage again for grazing. And so this is where Kernza fits great into regenerative systems because it can be used as a dual purpose crop. Next slide, please. Kernza, it has been evaluated for its ability to reduce nitrate leaching in the fall and throughout the season. So you can see this is a study conducted by Dr. Jacob Youngers at UMN. They tracked soil water nitrate over the course of the season. This top line in gray is corn and switchgrass. And Kernza is the yellow line on the bottom. And so you can see the degree to which Kernza keeps soil nitrate leaching down was 99% lower in a Kernza system compared to corn. So it has this incredible ability to reduce nitrate leaching into groundwater and surface waters in our systems. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. And then compared to soybean, the other part of that predominant, perhaps evil system is that Kernza is able to decrease nitrate leaching compared to soybean as well, which is something that we need to know because soybean is a legume, and Kernza being able to reduce nitrate there is very powerful as well. This ability of Kernza to reduce nitrate loading into our waters is very powerful. So again, this is just a schematic to show how annual greens, we're applying nitrogen via this big red arrow. It's leaching down through the soil profile. You see these little red dots are signifying the nitrate. That gets loaded into groundwater. It's sucked up through our wells and then ends up contaminating home drinking water levels. But for perennials, the power of Kernza to reduce nitrate leaching can be harnessed to mitigate and reduce this contamination of drinking water. This power has actually been deployed on wellhead protection areas. So researchers at UMN have planted Kernza around wellhead areas and are reducing groundwater contamination and contamination of those folks' wells. So we can deploy Kernza in real time to improve the living standards of folks in Minnesota and other areas throughout the US. Then the last slide I'll share is Kernza's ability to improve soil health. This figure just shows aggregate size on the left. And so that's a proxy or an indicator of larger aggregates indicate better soil structure and a greater ability to to increase infiltration, reduce soil erosion, and all of those good things. So we want aggregates to be high. If you look at Kernza, even after being in place for not too long, enhanced aggregate size, and so it's measurably increasing soil health. I'll hand it over to Colin.
Thanks, Nicole, and hi, everyone. My name is Colin Curitin. I work as the Director of Adoption and Scaling for the University of Minnesota's Forever Green Initiative commercialization team. I will briefly introduce an overview the current state of commercialization, supply chain, and market efforts for Kernza, and then hand it off to Anne. So again, Kernza is really the flagship crop out of a wider portfolio of crops and cropping systems that we call continuous living cover. Our partners at the Land Institute have a framework of natural systems agriculture. Again, Kernza is a trade name for these improved varieties of intermediate wheatgrass. The Land Institute owns the Kernza trademark, and we all work very closely with the Land Institute in partnership through this Kernza CAP project and other mechanisms to advance Kernza research and commercialization. Some of the economic benefits of Kernza, can you go back one slide, please? Several of the economic benefits of Kernza for producers include lower production costs, less tillage, annual seed, and inputs. Also in the marketplace, this crop has a phenomenal differentiation factor in terms of its environmental benefits and its story. And it's been receiving a significant amount of interest, as we'll speak to a bit later. Next slide, please. To overview the current state of Kernza commercialization, things are ramping up a bit. Several years ago, Kernza was really a vision that ran ahead of the reality. Now we have a multi-institutional commercialization team that is distributing thousands of pounds of test grain and flour to all manner of supply chain and market partners and supportive technical resources. We now have about 6,000 acres under production. As of last year, it was about 4,000. So we're seeing about a 50% increase in the last year. About a third of that production is in the upper Midwest. We have 5 nationally approved seed sources, 3 of those in the upper Midwest, and 16 licensed makers, including some recent big wins in the marketplace as far as launch of new products and visibility. Next slide. So this is just a visual of this growing momentum around what I would call the beginnings of a robust supply chain and marketplace for Kernza in our region. You have here Kernza production, seed sources, and processors. And the green is actually regions that have been prioritized by the state of Minnesota through an innovative pilot program to support the payment for both environmental benefit and risk management as we work towards some of the more systematic risk management strategies much discussed in the chat thread. Next slide. Here's a rough rollout of how we see near-term, mid-term, and long-term market opportunities shaping up. Earliest inclusions included some, front-running restaurants and distilleries and breweries, products that required low degrees of processing, like brewing, for example. With inclusion of a whole grain, we're kind of first to market. We're now starting to see the launch of whole grain and flour products, and also inclusions into shelf-stable products, like you see there that Cascadian Farms cereal box, which was launched in recent weeks. We also have a very close startup partner, B Corp Perennial Pantry, based in Burnsville, Minnesota, that in the depths of the pandemic sold Kernza grain and flour direct to consumer in 46 US states, which is pretty exciting. Next slide. So some quick notes on the economics and scaling of Kernza. As I mentioned, this unique grain in the marketplace is currently warrants quite a strong price. There's a lot of risk it takes to get there, so growers need to meet a food grade spec for a novel perennial grain crop. But if they're able to do that, they're seeing a fairly strong price. We're working with partners on the grower end to protect their economic interests on that front. We also know that in the long run, we expect yields to improve, supply to improve. That price may moderate, but the profitability can remain, and that will all aid uptake and scaling. I've included a couple scenarios there that if you're a conventional producer growing this for single-use grain, you're still going to be profitable in all likelihood. On the high end, if you're a certified organic dual-use producer growing for grain and forage, perhaps grazing that stand and producing a solid grain yield, you could net at current standards over $1,000 an acre. Don't everybody go plant Kernza tomorrow. Again, this is still a relatively high-risk endeavor, and the market's still in an early stage of development. You see on the right, this key message I want to leave us with here, that scaling is very much contingent on strong R&D investments for crop improvement. In 15 years, we've seen the breeding efforts triple the size of Kernza seed and move it from a predominantly non-free threshing grain to a free threshing grain. So these R&D investments connect very directly to, for example, Anne and her business partners' ability to put this crop on the landscape and move it into the market. Next slide. So these are just a few things in the last 6 months that we've seen roll out in the media and in the marketplace. Kernza was recently named as one of the top 10 food trends for 2022 by Whole Foods. We've seen pieces in the Washington Post, new products launched by Patagonian Provisions, Perennial Pantry, and Cascadian Farms, and a number of small and regional partners in baking and brewing and otherwise are increasingly including Kernza in their products. Next slide. To you, Ann.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, so I will just kind of touch on my perspective as one of the growers of Kernza. We have about 40 acres on our farm, which represents about 10% of our acreage for my husband and I. So for farmers, I think the golden rule is always don't plant a crop that you don't have a market for. Kernza's has been no different. We've been watching it from the sidelines, and especially, I mean, we're kind of at the tail end of it, but we're beginning farmers. So our tolerance for risk is relatively low, just without boatloads of working capital, basically, to get our way through thin times or take on additional risk. So Peter and I have been watching Kernza from the sidelines for a couple of years. We've been waiting for the agronomics to come along and give us kind of the confidence to jump in. It was seeing the work of the agronomics coming out of the University of Minnesota, along with the market development team. And I think that's really been the kicker for us, and the development of the Growers Cooperative that finally made us take the leap of faith to plant our first field of Kernza in 2020. It serves our farm in a variety of ways. We have, especially because we're organic, the big knock in organic and well-earned, frankly, is the amount of tillage that we have to do for our row cropping acres. And our row cropping acres are by far our most profitable, just like any other grain farm. It's the same in organic production, but we have to till it a lot. And so including a perennial on our landscape for 3 years gives our soil a chance to break up our compaction layers that we end up from so many passes over our ground. Having it really reduces our labor and equipment investment on those acres, especially relative to our other row crop acres. We plant it in the fall and we don't touch it again until we harvest in July, until we come through with the windrower. And it's also an easier, I'm going to say, plug and play perennial solution for grain farmers who don't necessarily have access to livestock or forage harvesting equipment. It achieves those goals of perennial agriculture, compaction reduction, erosion control, nutrient runoff, and weed control, without having to completely retool our equipment, because especially in grain production, every purchase that you do, and especially for something that's not a proven, you don't have a proven proof of concept on it, is a 5-figure, 6-figure investment in your operation. And again, as beginning farmers, we needed to find things that were kind of low cost of entry or low barrier to entry that we could get, achieve those soil health goals that we have on our operation. One of the challenges that face farmers right now is that people have mentioned this several times in the comments, we're taking on all the risk of planting these crops. There is no farm safety net. In traditional grain farming, this is delivered through crop insurance for farmers. We are also in the driver's seat, and we are taking a leadership role as the Perennial Promise Growers Cooperative to develop the markets and the supply chain infrastructure for selling these crops. The easy thing, frankly, is growing Kernza. Growing Kernza is really easy. It's the what comes after that you have it after it's harvested, those next steps. That's the challenge, and that's where we're at right now with it.
Great. Thank you, Ann. Really appreciate those comments from you're not in the combine seat today.
I'm not in the combine today. We're done harvesting corn. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, good. All right. Folks, we're going to take a short, Colin, are you going to come back and do a little bit on scalability?
I don't believe so. I think that's at the end of the winter oilseeds section, Steve.
Okay, great. Well, then we're going to take just a very short break here. We're running a few minutes behind schedule, as you might guess, so we might shorten up our Q&A, but we will still take a 5-minute break. And at the 2-minute point, we are going to run a video about the Kernza Cap project that you can watch if you're back in, and then we will start immediately after that. So what time is it? 11:12, and we actually have to go by the minute here because it's all tight. So 11:17, we'll be rolling into a discussion of the winter annual oil seeds. And maybe when you come back in, we'll just start it in 2 minutes, and we'll start up the program again at 11:17. So thank you. Let's just take a short break. Hope people are coming back from the break, and we're going to finish up the webinar here in the last hour, starting off with another presentation by one of the case studies of the continuous living cover crops. And these are the winter oil seeds that have been mentioned a few times, and we have the same cast of characters kicking this off. I think this time on my notes, we've got Colin starting off, and are you ready to roll, Colin? We're not seeing you there.
We're actually going to Nicole first.
Okay,
All
Nicole,
right.
The same order as last time. It's you,
Right.
Nicole.
All right, better jump in. All right, the two winter oilseed crops as part of the Forever Green portfolio are pennycress, which is sort of traditionally known as a weed, but had a lot of desirable domestication characteristics, just like kernza. The second is camellia, which has a long history of use as an oilseed, and which I first was introduced to by a grower pressing it for use as a biodiesel, which is pretty awesome. Next slide, please. The pennycress needs to undergo domestication as well, similar to canola, which is a better known oilseed, which is used for food applications. We've all, I'm sure, used canola in cooking. And so this sort of shows canola has a long history that I won't go into here of undergoing work. And so it's a great case study for what can be done with pennycress. Canola was domesticated, you see, for about a century that work took place, whereas pennycress is being developed much more rapidly, just over the last 10 years, and similar amounts of progress have already been made. Next slide, please. The way pennycress and camellia work are that they are cover crops, winter cover crops that can be planted in the fall, provide cover in the fall and spring, protecting soil, protecting water quality. However, these are distinct from traditional cover crops like winter rye in that they can be harvested and marketed, and the farmer can enjoy some profit from these crops. You can see they're planted in the fall. They're growing up very green and beautiful in April. They're already flowering in May, and the end of May, providing pollinator habitat, which I'll get into a little later. Then they're harvested in early June, and soybeans, in fact, can be planted right after them, or a summer annual. So you can get in that crops. This is an example of what we call relay cropping, where we can harvest 2 crops in 1 year. Next slide, please. Similar to what we saw with kernza, pennycress and camellia can reduce soil water nitrate pollution into groundwater. This is a study done comparing rye, that traditional cover crop that I mentioned earlier, to our winter oilseeds, pennycress and camellia. You see that these 2 winter oilseeds reduce nitrate loading and leaching to a similar degree as rye. And then these tilled and no-tilled bars on the left side of the graph signify the absence of a cover crop, and one field that received fall tillage and one field that did not receive fall tillage. So in essence, cover cropping in all scenarios was great for reducing nitrate loading compared to no cover cropping. Pennycress and camellia are performing similar to our other winter cover crops that are not harvested. Next slide, please. Here's just another study showing that camellia and pennycress were taking up a lot of nitrate in early June, when in a traditional corn or soybeans cropping scenario, we don't have much green in the fields at all, very little plants at that time if you had just planted corn or soybean. Compared to a full canopy, big plants of camellia and pennycress, they're able to capture a lot of the nitrogen that is in the soil profile, and that's a highly vulnerable time for nitrate leaching and pollution, that part of the year. In terms of phosphorus, which Margaret gave us a really awesome intro to earlier, this study found that phosphorus loading, or phosphorus running off or pollution, this is measuring total suspended solids, which is a very small particle of soil that's dissolved in water that is carrying phosphorus along with it. Pennycress reduced total suspended solids runoff to the greatest degree compared to conventional tilled soil, no-tilled soil, and even other winter cover crops like fall radish, which is that gray bar on the left. So if you look, we want TSS to be low. The pennycress and the winter camellia, the orange and yellow bars, are some of the lowest. So this is showing that these crops, these winter oilseeds, can be great for mitigating phosphorus pollution as well. Next slide, please. And I alluded to pollinator resources. Pollinators are most vulnerable in the early spring and the late fall in terms of the lack of pollen across the landscape. So having these beautiful flowering fields really early in the year can serve as an important source of pollen for honeybees and even native bees and flies and other pollinators as well. I'll hand it off. Oh, Colin, I'll let you speak to this.
Thanks. So the productivity of these systems A double cropped or relay cropped winter oilseed with a summer annual can produce up to 50% more oil than a monocrop. Now, one of the challenges is that you might get a little bit less of that summer annual and a lot more of an entire second crop. Also, there's a whole series of agronomic challenges to making that system work. And also the million-dollar question, can we develop end uses, supply chains, and markets for that new oilseed? So as far as these end uses, for winter camelina, just as an example, there's a number of very strong benefits for this oil. It has a relatively high oil content. It is a high omega-3 and 6 oil, similar to a flax oil, but with more oxidative stability due to high vitamin E. And it is currently under evaluation in R&D for oil as food and also plant-based protein, meal for a range of feed segments, bioplastics, camelina-based bioplastics and biopolymers, bio-based fuel. There's a huge rush right now, particularly to renewable diesel, that camelina is a very attractive option for. And there's also the whole cover crop seed market that, even if growers don't take this through to harvest, they still have all the benefits of a cover crop. Next slide. So the economics and scaling of the winter oil seeds, right now, the gold standard agronomic system for winter camelina in particular would be that we're following a small grain or corn silage or pea so that we can go into a clear field in the early fall, plant winter camelina, and then relay crop with soybean. We envision these systems thank you, as delivering a modest net revenue bump. It's not going to be a gold mine, but we're going to get all of those benefits of a cash cover crop with some extra revenue. We foresee in Minnesota alone a near-term 2 million acre potential for winter camelina. It's going to take a lot of effort to get there, but that's current acreage that is in the crops you see above, small grain, silage, pea, etc. When pennycress comes online, it is harvested even a bit earlier, and honestly, the potential is massive. Could be the biggest development in upper Midwestern agriculture akin to canola in Canada. Up to 75% of arable land that's currently in corn soy could be eligible for inclusion of pennycress. In addition to the yield and price of these crops, obviously the profitability is contingent on this interplay between the soybean yield and the winter oilseed yield. And the effective addressing of that challenge the viability of the system and its future scaling is largely contingent on this intensive crop R&D and subsequent commercialization. Next slide. So here's just a visual of that near-term scaling opportunity for winter camelina to follow a small grain and go into a soybean. Next slide. So we are engaged with a huge range of local, small, medium, and major food and agriculture industry partners on these oil seeds. I want everyone on this call to know that the world's largest food and agriculture companies are looking at these oil seeds as a key potential strategy to achieving those major climate, soil, and water goals that Nick Jordan mentioned earlier. They foresee all the same challenges that we do, and we are working together to try to address those in improving the genetics, the agronomy, building those supply chains and markets. But this is a very timely topic within these companies. This crop is in their labs and in their test fields, and we're very excited about that. Next slide. We are, as Dr. Nick Jordan mentioned, moving out onto the landscape pilot supply chain projects right now. For winter camelina, we have one active right now, industry coalition called MBOLD, coalition of the largest food and agricultural companies in the upper Midwest, are underwriting the costs to pilot this crop on 10 to 15 farms in Minnesota, including several with the Perennial Crops Growers Cooperative. And you see there on the left some of the activity that took place over the last few weeks, even just to get this crop in the ground and really launch this pilot. And it's quite exciting. Next slide. So I want to end with a note on scaling new sustainable technologies. A number of questions have come up in the thread. Is this really continuous? Is the yield enough? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I want everybody to zoom out from agriculture and really think about how we tend to scale sustainable technologies across the landscape, particularly in things like renewable energy. So it's very rare that the first generation sustainable innovation, like the first solar panel ever produced, is going to go to scale. Right? And that's effectively what we have. In the food and agriculture system, we are developing the equivalent of renewable energy, profitable technologies that can work for everyone in the system and get us the products that we need to run our society, but that address our critical environmental challenges. What we need to do is prove the concept with our early technologies that we launch, get those early wins, and rinse and repeat, improve that technology, scale it, improve that technology, scale it. Doing so requires significant public and private investment, and that technology improvement is going to aid adoption and scaling. Very importantly, though, a great technology alone does not change the food and agricultural system. Myriad other barriers need to be addressed, like many coming up in the chat thread. We have path-dependent systems, particularly food and agriculture. So there's crop insurance, there's technical assistance, there's value chain development. At the end of the day, society gets the food and agricultural system that we pay for. And so our formula needs to be to prioritize, commit, invest, and persevere. And I think you're going to be hearing in the later modules about some of the policy strategies we might be able to use to aid in this market-driven pathway. Just because it's market-driven doesn't mean that there's major policy priorities that need to come into play to make this feasible. Thanks.
All right, I'll try my best to help get us back on track with time, because I have a relatively short relationship with winter camelina, especially relative to my colleagues here in this module. I'll just refer back to Don Wise's comment from earlier that from the perspective of a grower, the agronomic improvements in these crops will really determine the adaptation of these crops. So we first planted our first experiment with winter camelina on 12 acres of our operation this fall, actually 6 weeks ago. And we did it following oats. In that partnership that Colin referred to with the MBOLD partnership, we were able to do that because of this de-risking program. Because I tossed it in the thread earlier that risk is kind of spreading out. Risk is the name of the game on our operation. Some comments had asked about broadleaf weed control on our farm. We found that winter annuals are kind of excellent weed control tools for our following cash crop, which is generally following these winter annuals is corn or soybeans. So along with Kernza, we are becoming more weather resilient by planting these fall seeded cash crops like winter camelina or Kernza, and getting those in the ground come springtime when our weather windows are really tight for planting due to kind of unpredictable springs. We've swung wildly, 3 years ago from an incredibly wet spring in 19, another very wet late spring in 20, and then a 30-year drought in 21. This unpredictability makes it tough to know for your planning how much time you're going to need to get your traditional row crops in the ground, your oats, for our case, our small grain, or our row crops, corn and beans. Having winter camelina and Kernza in the ground spreads out our labor and our risk. So I hope that gives some grower perspective to why we use these crops and how we get those in our ground. That picture of my family is from probably when both my husband and I had a lot more hair and fewer grays, and our kids were much smaller. But this is a pretty overgrown rye field there.
But next to that, I assume is that winter camelina, or is that pennycress?
That is winter camelina on the left. So it really takes off in the spring. I'm really excited to see how it looks. We planted it. Again, we didn't want to necessarily retool our equipment system. We can't afford to do that without grant money or some kind of help. So we seeded our winter camelina with oats as a nurse crop that will winter kill, just to kind of use the existing drill that we have. It's been great to work with the University of Minnesota to experiment with this and kind of group problem solve as we go. That picture that Colin, that group of pictures that Colin had earlier from all the other farmers that he's visited getting the winter camelina in the ground this fall, they are a resource to me as a grower. This network of growers has become, a huge resource for us as with technical assistance, grower to grower knowledge through partnership with the University of Minnesota. Steve, I think you're muted.
Yeah, we can't hear you, Steve.
Steve, yeah, we can't hear you, Steve. Well, let's turn it over to Nick.
Terrific. Peter, can you cue up my slides? Not that I don't love Anne's image there. Well, great. I'm going to take just a few minutes to check in with everyone about a very important part of the development of the continuous living cover crops and the whole concept of continuous living cover agriculture that we're talking about today. And I want to highlight and underscore a key commitment of the Forever Green Partnership. And that is that forever green agriculture or continuous living cover agriculture must also be forever equitable. In other words, the development of this concept of agriculture must not perpetuate current social problems in agriculture. And so if I could have the next slide, Peter. So some of the social problems in agriculture that we are hereby affirming that we will try very hard not to perpetuate as we advance continuous living cover agriculture are the existence of historically excluded communities, specifically BIPOC people in particular, the effective exclusion of young farmers and farmers operating mid-sized operations against whom there are many barriers to their participation in agriculture, and has highlighted some of those at the level of the costs of farming equipment. Thirdly, the declining share of wealth that farmers are able to realize from the total wealth creation in our agriculture and food systems. And then finally, that declining share of wealth that rural communities receive as well. Next slide, Peter. So another very important premise of our work around equity and inclusion as we develop CLC agriculture is that we highlight and acknowledge that BIPOC and indigenous farmers and agriculturalists in general have in fact developed many forms of continuous living cover agriculture over millennia. And so we consider our work to be part of that work stream, but we want to acknowledge and thank all those farmers from indigenous cultures all around the world. Next slide, please, Peter. So the forever equitable pledge in some sense that we've made about forever green and continuous living cover agriculture is being embodied by a working group in the Forever Green Partnership that is implementing a strategy to try to make sure that equity and inclusion are at the foreground as we go forward. Next slide, Peter, please. So let me just tell you the two basic pillars of that strategy as it's developing and being implemented. We are making a substantial investment in building lasting co-creative relationships with what we think of as equity innovators in food and agriculture. So these are multiple and wide-ranging, these innovators. I would highlight the Perennial Promise Growers Co-op, which is working on this issue of farmers getting a fair share of wealth creation that results from continuous living cover agriculture. And there are quite a few others that we are working on. The point being not asking them to enlist in the Forever Green Partnership, but asking them how can we have lasting co-creative relationships as we go forward in which our project supports their projects and vice versa. And that's the goal, that's the aim. And we are dedicating personnel and other resources in a bunch of different ways in a variety of collaborative projects with these equity innovators. I would wish I had time to outline what some of these efforts are, but to keep things flowing, I'm going to pass the talking stick along here. But we wanted to take a second just to highlight this commitment to Forever Equitable at the heart of Forever Green. Back to you, Steve.
Thank you, Nick. And, we could do another whole seminar or webinar on that very topic, and that's not what we're doing here today, but we did want to acknowledge that that's an important piece of this overall effort, and as well it needs to be. We are running, no big surprise, a little behind time. What we're going to do is we'd take a few questions here, and then we're going to ask Trevor if he could shorten up his presentation some, because that can also be provided as a Word doc or a list. Some of that can be provided to participants afterwards. Thank you, Trevor, for agreeing to do that. We've had a lot of good dialogue in the chat. That is great to see. And we have also some questions coming in the Q&A. And what I would like to do is ask for maybe some volunteers from our panelists, if they could respond to some of the Q&A questions. I'm thinking particularly about, we have one in here about risk management and Kernza crop and the challenges there. We've had quite a bit of discussion about that. Is there somebody in our team who would like to take that on and respond to the challenges of especially these relay crops and insurance?
Sure, I'll briefly try to speak to that. We're in touch with RMA on all this for Kernza and Camellia in particular. It's as I see here in the comment, we do think it's a good idea. It's just a long road to get there. There's a long pathway to working with RMA to getting a pilot program and county by county approval for these crops. You need to demonstrate 3 years of production and market revenue. We have a lead contact there. On Camellia, one of the main challenges with a relay cropping system is potential threat to your summer annuals crop insurance, in addition to getting new insurance products available on those winter annual cash cover crops. Whole farm revenue protection is a good pathway, but then you need to be working with growers that are either already in that program or open to shifting their whole farm's insurance strategy over to whole farm revenue protection.
Good, thanks, Colin. Let's keep the Q&A going in the chat, and let's move on with a presentation. And it's great because there have been a number of people on the Kernza team and on the Continuous Living Cover team who've been responding to questions, so it's a great dialogue. Trevor, let's go to you. And if we could look at about 5 minutes about the federal barriers and opportunities that we've been talking about, you've been working up. That would be great, and we can provide additional information on that piece. So, Trevor? And Trevor, I should say, I'm sorry, I didn't introduce him early. He is the Water Quality Director at Friends of the Mississippi River.
Thank you, Steve, and thumbs up if folks can hear me okay. All right, I'm gonna do this all in 5 minutes, I hope. So it's fair to acknowledge that CLC crops are not always playing on a level playing field with traditional commodity crops, and there are some unique barriers and exciting opportunities to bridge the sort of valley of death that Nick mentioned earlier. Detailing all of those would be like a multi-day conference. I've got 5 minutes, so I'm gonna just walk through 5 families of innovations that are available to us. Next slide. The first relates to genetics and scaling. Modern breeding practices have significantly sped up the time it takes to identify and breed favorable plant characteristics, but faster doesn't make it fast. We need to invest in genetics, supply chains, agronomics, and markets all together. The biggest opportunity we have is to significantly increase funding for CLC research and pilot programs via federal grant programs. That would include FFAR, AFRI, SARE programs, and pursue opportunities to dedicate new federal CLC research funds to land grant institutions and other leading research centers. Next slide. The second group is related to value chain and enterprise development. The barrier here is that investing in value chain enterprises is a challenge for crops that don't yet have mature markets. There are a lot of federal innovations available to us. That can include dedicating funding for CLC enterprises within existing programs, like the Value Added Producer Grants, AMS, and the Local Agriculture Marketing Program, or LAM. We can explore tax incentives or other financial instruments for new or emerging CLC-centric enterprises. We can fast track GRAS certification for remaining CLC crops that don't have it. Animate federal grants and loans that allow producers to borrow against CLC grain values to fund supply chain infrastructure, for example, on-grain storage facilities. And then up here in Minnesota, we're working on a CLC value chain development fund specifically designed to provide more money to value chain enterprises. A federal CLC value chain development fund would be an excellent complement. Next slide. The third bucket is risk, and we've talked a lot about this in the chat, so I won't belabor it, but banks and FSA don't love giving loans for new crops with perceived higher risk, and RMA doesn't have the right crop insurance portfolio that we need. There's also an equity lens here, as Nick mentioned. If only the most risk-tolerant producers can engage in CLCs, that risks further entrenching our existing inequities. Some opportunities include the RMA should fast-track development of crop insurance products specifically for CLCs and modify and improve whole farm revenue protection programs to better accommodate CLCs. We could establish state and federal initiatives modeled after Minnesota's ECO implementation program, which provides risk mitigation, cost share, and ecosystem service payments for producers in CLC pilot programs. We can support establishment of CLC grower cooperatives, work with farm lenders to develop new loans tailored for multi-year CLC crop cycles, specialty equipment and other instruments that account for the long-term resilience of CLC systems, and make publicly supported bridge financing available to growers to transition to perennial systems. We could also talk about providing advantageous crop insurance terms for traditional crops that operate as a part of a larger CLC rotation. And the last two here, when it comes to cost share and financial assistance, we've noted what some of those barriers are, and I'm just going to give you 3 examples. We have EQIP practices. Practice 512, you can get assistance for planting kerns as forage, but you can't harvest the grain. EQIP 327, you can plant kerns as a conservation crop, but you can't harvest it. We have a conservation crop rotation practice, EQIP 328, but you get less financial assistance. So let's talk about exploring pathways to make EQIP, CSP, CRP, and other farm programs more compatible with CLC practices. Consider allowing harvest of winter annual oilseed cover crops planted through cover crop incentives programs, at least while winter oilseeds markets are maturing, and better fund things like the Grazing Lands Conservation Initiative and increase funding for the National Agroforestry Center for compatible CLC practices. And then lastly, in terms of technical assistance and equipment access, as Ann noted earlier, not all, some, though not all CLC crops benefit from specialized farm equipment that isn't always affordable. Technical assistance for these specific cropping systems isn't always available, and many small farms, beginning farms, and farmers of color don't always have equitable access to federal resources. So we want to encourage, create and deploy sort of widely available CLC train-the-trainer modules for NRCS staff and others who provide technical assistance to growers, including private providers. Explore innovative equipment cost share and timeshare programs, and this can include working with farm lenders to develop new loans and financial instruments, and then consider where these innovations can be prioritized to better allow underserved farmers to access these initiatives. Steve, I think that was 5 minutes. I'm going to call it a day and pass it back to you.
Wow, all I can say is amazing. That was 5 minutes, so great work, Trevor. And those slides were wonderful and did a good overview, and we will make those available to folks who are interested. We'll share the whole set. Great. Well, let's move into the last section as we're moving into the close of our time here. And we have 2 policy experts that we're really looking forward to hearing from, who have particularly Ferd Hafner, who is the principal with the Food, Farm, and Environmental Policy Consulting. Actually, it's Farm, Food, and Environmental Policy, I believe. But he has many years of experience of working in and out of the Farm Bill and has an excellent perspective on what's doable and not doable there. So, Ferd, would you share some thoughts on this topic with the rest of us?
Yeah, great. And thanks, Steve. And it's been a wonderful event here. I'm so glad it's happening. Sorry, I don't have any slides to share with you. Didn't quite get my act together in time for that. Wonderful presentation, Trevor. A great laundry list. And I, of course, don't have time to talk about all those things, but each one could be a day in of itself. But I'm only going to emphasize 3 things. I think they're, the obvious 3 immediate things for people to be aware of, and probably most people on this event know about all of them, but I will just go through them in order. So I'm going to start with the Climate Smart Agriculture and Forestry Partnership Program. Maybe not everybody's used to those CSA FPP acronym yet, but you will be. That's the administrative action that the Biden and Vilsack administration is taking to potentially use the Commodity Credit Corporation to do some innovative climate smart agriculture and forestry programs, starting with pilot programs. So let me, and then I'm going to talk about the pending Build Back Better budget reconciliation bill, and then finally the 2023 Farm Bill. And I can obviously only touch briefly on all of those, but let's start with that first one, and perhaps the most important one, I think, for this initiative. The administration requested general comments on climate smart ag back in March 16th, Federal Register, if you want to look it up. They then proceeded to publish a USDA progress report on climate smart ag and forestry in May of this year. And then at the end of September 30th, they issued a request for information through the Federal Register, asking for specific comments, 10 pages or less. I think they got a little inundated back in the first round, so they kept it short. And they, as part of this request for information, they invented a new term called climate smart commodity. That's a whole discussion unto itself. I'll just briefly say that because of the way the Commodity Credit Corporation statute is written, you have to be talking about commodities. And so they've invented this term climate smart commodity, because if they were simply talking about a conservation type of practice or farming system program, it wouldn't be legal under the Commodity Credit Corporation. Anyway, that's a whole separate discussion that you don't need to pay too much attention to. That comment period closed early this week on November 1st. I just looked it up before we went online here. There were 378 submissions, which you can read on regulations.gov if you're so inclined. Just about every trade association, quite a few companies, and quite a few individual farmers submitted comments. So where is all that going? That's leading to a notice of funding availability, or NOFA, as the government likes to call it, that should be coming up, fairly rapid order after they go through the comments and write the NOFA. It's widely rumored that that's going to be initially $1 billion to fund between 10 and 20 pilot programs. So you're talking about $50 to $100 million pilot programs. It's widely perceived that those pilots will be a precursor to a climate bank through the CCC, or what I like to call the triple dip, so that corn and soybeans and other major commodities not only get commodity program payments and the bulk of crop insurance subsidies, but also will get the bulk of this, which leads me to the most important point I will make, which is there's got to be alternative options. And perennials in general, including the oilseeds and grains that you've been talking about here today, are actual commodities that are fully legal under the Commodity Credit Corporation for support. You don't have to invent some new terminology to get them covered. So that's the most important thing I think I'll say, is that, there's $1 billion coming up, and there's probably another $1 billion after that. And if a few of those pilot projects aren't on grazing and agroforestry and alternative oilseeds and small grains and perennial crops, then we've really blown the biggest opportunity that we'll have in a long time. So get your proposal ready, and that can include R&D and supply chain work, but also safety net, de-risking, simple direct payments to the crops you've been talking about. So big opportunity. It's coming quick. You need to be ready. That's my biggest thing I'll say. So quickly turning to Build Back Better. It's going to the House maybe today. Hopefully will be done by Thanksgiving. As we speak, there's roughly $28 billion for conservation programs and roughly $2 billion for ag research. a lot less on ag research than we had a few weeks ago, but still something there. Also renewable energy, including on-farm renewable energy, but I won't talk about that now. The two things or three things I'd flag most in the conservation provisions is that there's a doubling of resources for the Conservation Innovation Grant on-farm R&D program, including the soil health demonstration program. So that's going to go up to $50 million a year. So that's a real opportunity. If you want to get a CIG on-farm, you know, either use the soil health one or use the general one if you want to aim more on water quality. That's a real opportunity. Secondly, a huge amount of the resources in conservation are going to the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, RCPP. Another great opportunity to do programming around the crops you're talking about. And then last, and in my view least, but in the bill is $5 billion for Farm Service Agency to start a new cover crop payment program. You're going to pay $25 an acre. It's really it's $5 billion only because that's what it's estimated to cost. It will actually wind up costing whatever, it will cost whatever 25 times the number of acres that sign up for the program. So the sky is the limit there. On the research side, there's money for AFRI, which is what funded Cap Kernza and Kernza Cap, or however you refer to it. There's $210 million boost to AFRI. A lot of that will go to the Sustainable Ag Systems Program, undoubtedly. There's a $120 million boost for the Sustainable Ag Research and Education Program, the SARE program, and a $60 million boost for the Organic Research Extension Research and Extension Program. So all of that means there's going to be a sudden boost of more money on the table for research through AFRI, through SARE, through REI. Unfortunately, in the original bill, when it was $3.5 trillion instead of the new slimmed down version, there was also money for ARS's long-term agro-ecosystem research. Unfortunately, that has fallen off the table, which I'm really disappointed about. But anyway, on the research side, get your proposals ready. There will be bigger RFPs coming out in the near future with a lot more money at stake. So turning quickly, last one, 2023 Farm Bill. It's obviously, you know, right around the corner. There's, you know, research title and credit and marketing and crop insurance and conservation and on and on and on. My word of advice would be to distill, you know, it was a great list that Trevor went through. Distill your priorities down to one or two, or at very most three, and really refine them. You know, find your allies, join your coalitions. I would, you know, particularly flag the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition as one that you'll want to deal with. Really importantly, find your congressional champions. Upper Midwest is lucky. Both Minnesota senators are on the Ag Committee. Both Iowa senators are on the Ag Committee. You know, you've got lots of representation, but you got to work to get them to be champions of what you prioritize. And then the most important thing I'll say about the 2023 Farm Bill is that 2022 is the critical year. This and early in 2022 is particularly critical. So you need to have your bills, your champions, your allies, obviously your priorities, and start to form the coalitions and start to get press attention to your issues. If you wait until January of 2023, you're already out of the game. So this is a next year activity. I can't stress that enough. So I'll just leave it there. I'm sure, you know, there's a lot more, much more that could be said, but that will hopefully wet people's whistle a little bit.
Thank you so much, and thank you for doing that expeditiously. And we are going to go just a few minutes past, and I hope people can stay with us. We have Chad Lord, who is the Advocacy Director for the Healing Our Waters Coalition. And he's just going to make some comments from the Howe perspective, and we really appreciate Chad and Howe for co-hosting this webinar today.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and thank you for inviting us to participate and co-host. This has been kind of a merging of both personal and professional for me personally. Professionally, I've been working for over a decade on trying to draw attention with groups like Steve's in Minnesota on the contribution of agricultural runoff to water quality quality problems across the Great Lakes and the entire nation, but also personally, because I grew up in Southwest Minnesota and have family who are active farmers in that region. And so, Anne, your images brought back a lot of fond memories of driving down Highway 19 and seeing those rows of beans and corn. So appreciate that opportunity to go down memory lane. Anyways, as Ferd was saying, yes, definitely get connected to coalitions like the Healing Our Waters Great Lakes Coalition. Want to see as part of the 2023 Farm Bill process. The Healing Our Waters Great Lakes Coalition, a coalition of over 170 non-governmental organizations, will be working on Farm Bill next year and are looking for ideas of what we should be prioritizing as part of our advocacy. We do bring in people to Washington and connect them to their decision makers on a regular basis, and would love to continue to learn more about these issues, as well as anything else that people are focusing on as it relates to agriculture and how we can reduce agricultural runoff impacts on our water quality as part of our policy platform. We will be spending the next couple of months talking to our membership to see what is a priority for folks, and then build that into a policy platform, which will hopefully then be carried by our members when they're here in Washington in early March next year, and then throughout the remainder of 2023. I would also suggest, in addition to the Sustainable Agriculture Coalition that Ferd mentioned, there are a number of other groups. There's a coalition called the Clean Water for All Coalition, which has a nutrient work group that is also doing its work, due diligence on developing its platform for Farm Bill. A conservation coalition, which also exists, that does also similar work. Everybody is doing kind of this planning right now, and I definitely would encourage folks to get plugged into those processes, bring these ideas forward, get them socialized, build support for them as priorities, so they can be carried next year as people are reaching out to your members of Congress and building support for these ideas so they can be put into whatever Farm Bill is created in 2023. So that's it. That's all I have for that. And I would be happy to answer questions if there are any, but really appreciate the opportunity to watch this presentation and be part of it today.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Chad. And you were speaking on fast forward, so appreciate that. That was a lot of area that you covered. And we really appreciate working with the How Coalition and the great work that the coalition has done, and look forward to also linking in the other groups that Ferd and you mentioned into this quest. I do want to mention just a couple of things as we close up. Aaron put in the chat that the reminder that this Kernza CAP is a project through the USDA, and the grant information is in the chat. We did mention that earlier on. And I also really want to thank the people who could participate. We've had a good audience throughout this entire 2 hours plus, and especially thank the many speakers who took their time to put together their thoughts and condense them down into a concise manner and do a presentation with slides. And so thank you to everyone for making this a success. We are recording this, and we will post it where it can be available for people to come and view at a later time. And I think that's it, unless any of the other panelists have anything that they want to add in. We'll call it a day. We're about 4 minutes after, so we'll wrap it up.
Thank you for facilitating, Steve.
Well, my pleasure. My pleasure. All right. Thank you all, and have a good day. Have a good weekend.
What's exciting about Kernza CAP is that we get to be on the forefront of getting this new crop Kernza out into the world, and hopefully be an example of how to develop other new crops in the future and get them out into the marketplace as well.
As we move into the future, farmers and rural communities need more options for economic opportunities, while we also improve the environmental sustainability of food production. Kernza, the first commercially available perennial grain, is a great opportunity because it can be used in various food and beverage products, but also improve water quality, prevent soil erosion, and draw down carbon. The University of Minnesota is helping to get this crop on the landscape and into the marketplace, thanks in part to Kernza CAP, which is a highly collaborative project that builds on years of ongoing partnership with organizations and institutions across the country. The project brings together scientists, industry leaders, policymakers, and farmers to scale Kernza research and activities.
We have a lot to do at once to drive change. Plant breeding helps us develop cultivars that yield more grain and enhance ecosystem services. And field experiments help us understand how to best grow Kernza while maintaining ecosystem services. We're working with policymakers to expand public support and reduce risk for new growers. And we're working with supply chain partners to develop Kernza products and get them out into the marketplace. Some Kernza CAP collaborators have already developed delicious Kernza products and are working hard to get Kernza from the field onto your plate.
So Perennial Pantry is a dedicated Kernza processor and food brand that's working to bring Kernza to market and to help scale this really exciting new crop across acreages and try to open up contracts and markets for farmers while we make this new food easier and easier for a wider group of people to eat. Right now, as a food company, we have our sort of public-facing, direct-to-consumer brand where we're selling Kernza flour that's whole grain, we're selling Kernza whole grain kernels, and then we just launched a pancake mix. I think getting involved in Kernza CAP for us is all about the partners and genuinely believing that this is such a large vision, and the only way it will be successful is if many, many different stakeholders all lift it up together. I think Kernza genuinely has the opportunity to become something that can impact so many rural communities, really genuinely impact our environment at scale, help so many growers, and be an exciting food to integrate into tons and tons of kitchens across the US and the world. And so I think to really be able to see that come to fruition, we need to work in huge partnership. And Kernza CAP is such an exciting, tangible example of how that's happening and how you can have really core institutions like the U of M and like the Land Institute that can come together and set a really strong foundation that so many different partners can work together in concert and then really be able to make this happen.
How we're doing this work is just as important as what we're doing. We have a long-term transformative vision of agriculture. Even within our team, we foster equity and an open culture across all of our partners. We hope Kernza can serve as a model of future perennial crops and foster inspiration and creativity in creating agricultural systems that are equitable and that fit a wide range of contexts and societal needs.